Hello, political scientists. Welcome to the next instalment in our look at the UK political system. We've done the theory, we've done Parliament, and we've done Constitution. I guess that means we're on to the executive, which you might have noticed from today's earlier task, is mainly the Cabinet and the Prime Minister. And we're going to talk about what powers they have, why they are called the executive, what that actually means in terms of UK politics, which I'm sure you've realised is different to most other political systems because we overlap our three areas. We've done the Constitution, which is kind of the roadmap, how you run a country. We've done Parliament, which is kind of the legislature. So this is the executive. And then we'll finish off by looking at the judiciary, which is still a word I find difficult to say. So without further ado, let's move on to the exciting stuff, which is the knowledge. And it's the best bit. So standard procedure here. I have myself a PowerPoint. I know, it's so exciting. I'm not writing on a whiteboard. I'm in a white void, but no whiteboard. Ooh, I have light from the sun. Do you see that in the corner? I see that in the corner. So the PM and the executive. Here is a picture of the cabinet taken when they were first announced back in 2020. 2020. Back before coronavirus. Can you imagine the days? Most of the members are the same because we've been involved in a crisis since then, and cabinet reshuffles, which used to happen fairly regularly, haven't been for whatever reason. So let's talk. Let's talk about the executive. What is it exactly? Well, essentially, it's the bit that does the government. Who am the government? The government and the executive. That tends to be how it works. It is all the different sections, all the different bits, all the different components that make up governing. So in practical terms, that's the Prime Minister and his cabinet. I shall remove myself from the way. Here are the cabinet ministers. Now, you've gone through a lot of these already because I asked you specifically to look at them earlier today. If you haven't done that task yet, and you're still waiting to do that task, can I please ask you pause the video and go back and do that task? Not because I'm going to give you the answers, by the way, though I've got names here next to the images, but because, quite simply, it's more fun that way, and then you'll know stuff before I reveal it, and you'll be like, oh. So, yeah, this is the cabinet as it was in 2020, as reported in a newspaper. That's why you've got the graphic of number 10 Downing Street behind them, because apparently we can't cope without backgrounds, says I. But it includes junior ministers. These are just the senior cabinet ministers, those in charge of a Department of State. More on that in a moment. Thank you. They are served by the civil service. The civil service also counts as an element of the executive, as they make the governing happen. They are the ones that take legislation and turn it into something that can be dealt with. And also that they go along and they turn the ideas of government into something that can be turned into a law in the first place. And the civil service does not change when governments do. So the executive involves the state, and the civil service is part of the state. It does not change when governments do, though governments can change it. For example, the most powerful member of the civil service is the Chief Secretary to the Cabinet. And the new Chief Secretary to the Cabinet, appointed in September 2020, was Simon Case, previously working on the staff of Prince William. He was called up when the last Chief Secretary to the Cabinet was forced to resign as not being Brexity enough. Basically argued that there would be delays at the border, that there would be bureaucracy and red tape that would destroy small businesses, and that we'd have smaller export-driven businesses having to relocate to the EU. And we were told that he was briefing against the government and that he was a dangerous lone cannon and needs to be got rid of because that's not what the civil service should do. And none of that would happen anyway. So anyway, the new Chief Secretary of the Cabinet is Simon Case. But it also counts the Cabinet Office, which is all the civil servants that work with the Cabinet. and the number 10 policy unit. The number 10 policy unit was introduced by Tony Blair. Tonty Blair is behind this, imagine it in caps. And they're there to basically come up with ideas for the Prime Minister to then pilot and use, though theoretically, because the Prime Minister is in charge of Cabinet, the Prime Minister can get any of the Cabinet to do those things, to make them fly. The previous head of the policy unit was Dominic Cummings. What do they do? What's their functions? Well, the function of the executive is to introduce new legislation to Parliament. I've written new legis to Parl because, frankly, writing legislation to Parliament takes a long time, and Parliament's tricksy to spell. How do they do this? Well, they do this through the Queen's Speech, the state opening of the Houses of Parliament. The Queen's Speech is basically a sort of a teaser trailer. It says, here are the things we're going to do with our government. I'm going to announce all the different policy areas. That's my Queen voice. And then she announces them all in order and says, and there will be other measures that will be introduced to you. So it's all the stuff that was in the manifesto. It's all the stuff that the ruling party has a mandate to do. It's announced at the beginning of every state opening of Parliament what that Parliament aims to do by the end of it and what the areas of legislation are. The extra bit and other methods that will be introduced to you, or measures, if I can speak properly, I can't, by the way, you might have noticed I failed miserably at basic English, is called the doctor's mandate, which fittingly we can use as an example, coronavirus. The doctor's mandate essentially says that other things will have to come about as a reaction to events that couldn't be predicted, or crises that the country faces, or just some stuff that comes up and you can't plan for in a manifesto. In this case, coronavirus is pretty big as something that wasn't in the manifestos or the mandate, and therefore the response to it is known as the doctor's mandate, whereby the government, the executive, can respond to that and do what is necessary. Obviously, not announce that at the state opening of Parliament because they didn't know it was coming back in the state opening of Parliament back in January last year. And, well, they kind of did, but they didn't know what was coming, if that makes sense. And the latest state opening of Parliament, sure, they could have mentioned it. They did, in fact. But again, since then, we've had Christmas and everything that's occurred there. They also introduced the budget. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, yes, I've written Chan X, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chancellor Chancellor of the Exchequer, EXCHEQ, yeah, I know, UER. It's QUER, because of course it is. We're English, and why can't we have normal spelling? This is negotiated, I've written neg, with, I've written W, the Prime Minister, PM, because you don't need to write Prime Minister in an exam. You just don't, by the way, you just don't. I know I usually do with a line, like a // because W with a dot when I write it on your work means weak version of whatever follows, but I forgot when I was doing this, and I've literally just realised as I'm going through now, and I apologise. But it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer who's supposed to come up with the budget, not the Prime Minister themselves, and they negotiate with the Prime Minister what can be arranged. The idea being that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the second most powerful person in Cabinet, the most powerful being Prime Minister. Of course, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, was put in place when the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer refused point blank to have his advisors picked by the advisor to the Prime Minister, meaning that Rishi Sunak is pretty much Boris Johnson's lapdog, and when he says stuff in public, it's with Boris Johnson's say-so. And if it's not with Boris Johnson's say-so, he doesn't say it. So when he opposes lockdown, that's with Boris Johnson's say-so. When he did Eat Out to Help Out, that's with Boris Johnson's say-so. When he says there's money for this but not for that, it's with Boris Johnson's say-so. He's not a normal chancellor. He does not have his own independent power base because of the strictures that he accepted when he took the job. Keep that in mind because that's unusual. There have been other prime ministers that control their chancellors in a similar way, by the way. This is nothing new. But it is interesting to keep in mind when you, well, hear news stories about Rishi Sunak, I suppose. They also do secondary or delegated legislation. sometimes known as the Henry VIII clauses or the Henry VIII powers. And that means when a law's already been passed by Parliament but requires an adaptation or a small change to make it legal or just keep it up to date, they can do that without going back to Parliament. So passing a law about the packaging or the price of plastic bags, for example, in shops, there's now a 5p levy, which is passed on directly to the customer. You might say, oh yeah, we also need to include this new type of plastic bag, or we also need to include these new things that they're handing out free to customers, or we also need to include these businesses that didn't exist beforehand. And that doesn't have to go back to Parliament. That just says, well, the law was there, the legislation includes this, we just didn't foresee this change, so we're going to make that change now. And that is secondary or delegated legislation. This has become a bit of a hot topic in recent years since the coalition and the first majority Conservative government in 2015 since 1992, because they've been using it a lot. They don't tend to go back to Parliament in a way that we're just not used to in the UK system. So is it being abused? Well, that's a story for another time, but certainly be aware that there's a big debate about whether or not it's being used too much. I don't know, it could turn up in an exam, for example. So that's what the executive is. The big cheese in the executive, not being Edam or Emmental, is the Prime Minister himself. Hence, my box is right over the top of the Prime Minister. See what I did there? I was quite proud of myself. Where does he get his power from? Well, principally, the monarch. The monarch, in this case the Queen, I'm the Queen, gets to ask a trusted advisor to form a government. Now, she can pick, or they can pick, depending on the monarch, she at the moment, I mean, as far as we know, asks a trusted advisor, anybody. She can pick, theoretically, anybody to head the government. And it comes from when we had a German king who didn't speak English, who picked someone from Parliament to basically translate for him and to do business, because he couldn't be bothered to turn up to Parliament all the day, every day, and listen to a bunch of language that he literally couldn't understand. So he got someone to do it for him. And that minister was called the Prime Minister. They were part of the government, they formed the government, they set out the ideas from the monarch, they took ideas from Parliament to the monarch, and they did the business of the executive without bothering the monarch too much. And initially, it was someone they trusted. With the development of political parties, however, that has become anybody who can command support in the House of Commons. And therefore, the leader of the largest political party can usually be counted upon to get the legislative agenda through Parliament. That's how elections work. We've talked about this. So the leader of the largest party tends to be the Prime Minister. Now, that's not always true. So although it's usual, so when you get a new leader of a party, we get a new Prime Minister. We don't elect a Prime Minister. There are no elections for Prime Minister. Prime Ministers are not chosen by us. They're chosen by the monarch. So although in a general election we can change the Prime Minister to the person who leads the largest party, more often than not, the Prime Minister comes when they change the leader of a large party, at least in the modern era. You go back before 1979, it's much more predictable that an election changes a Prime Minister. But once 1979 rolled around, things changed. I'll explain in a moment. So, for example, it's not always the leader of the largest party. Winston Spencer Churchill, WSC as I refer to him, in May 1940 was made Prime Minister, and he did not lead the Conservatives. That man was Neville Chamberlain. Furthermore, the Conservative Party did not like him. They refused to cheer for his speeches in Parliament unless a hanky was dropped. They'd cheer for the hanky, they would not cheer for Churchill. Churchill was massively unpopular with his own party. Now, if you do history, you might well have come across that already. I know you haven't, Stan, you've been doing Russia. But yeah, that was why he was made Prime Minister. Wait, so you said he was made Prime Minister because he was unpopular with the party? Well, he was made Prime Minister because he was the only person the king at the time believed was capable of holding together a coalition of parties to fight the war. So all the opposition parties, I say all the opposition parties, the Liberals and Labour, both liked Churchill. He was seen as a man of action. The public felt that he was doing something and a lot of people weren't seen to be doing something. So despite the fact that the king preferred Lord Halifax, who said that he lacked the capabilities, and would much have preferred Chamberlain, who he liked, he chose Churchill, and Churchill accepted, provided Chamberlain provided advice, and his foreign advisor, the most powerful foreign secretary, the most powerful person really in a war other than the Prime Minister, was Lord Halifax, who agreed. It was a rare moment of understanding on Churchill's part the limitations of what he could do as a person in a position of power. The convention is that the Prime Minister has to be in the House of Commons, and the only people allowed in the House of Commons are commoners. So you can't go in if you're a lord or a lady. You're simply not allowed except by express invitation. And you're not allowed whilst they're making business. Now, this was put in place during the Civil War, as you can imagine, and it was a means of sort of keeping power for the politicians, the members of Parliament, the House of Commons, rather than giving some of the power to the Lords as well. Now, this is a convention, there's no law, and it was proved by Douglas Home. So Lord Douglas Home was made Prime Minister, but before he took the position, he renounced his peerage, taking away the Lord from his name, just becoming Douglas Home, and then stood in a by-election where a member of his party resigned in his favour, so that the people could choose whether or not he went to the House of Commons. Now, it was a safe Tory seat. He was always going to get in. But the point is, he went to all that rigmarole so that he could sit as head of the government in 1963, thus proving the convention that you can only lead the government now if you're in the House of Commons. It wasn't always so. You go back before the 1920s, and you regularly have lords leading the government as Prime Minister. But since 1945, it's been considered kosher, for want of a better phrase, that you've got to be in the House of Commons in order to lead the House of Commons. And so this proved the point. So interesting chap, Douglas Home. And I thought it'd be interesting because it's in 1963 to get a colour photograph of him in 1963 because it amuses me. In 1976 and onwards, things have changed. 5 of the last 8 prime ministers, yes, we don't count them as a new prime minister every time there's an election, have been due to the resignations of the previous office holder, not put in by general election. The first of these, of course, going backwards, is Boris Johnson, who was made Prime Minister in 2019 when Theresa May resigned. He was not made Prime Minister by the general election of December 2019. Rather, the general election of December 2019 confirmed his position and means that he continues as Prime Minister now. It amuses me that the way I've put these images up, it looks like he's framed by that curtain that Douglas Home somehow has a portrait of Bojo. Yeah, bless them. Theresa May also became Prime Minister not through a general election, but in 2016 when David Cameron announced the results of the EU referendum and promptly resigned, leaving Theresa May to take over. So she became Prime Minister by default. She was not appointed by a general election. Now, sure, she faced a general election in 2017, which she narrowly scraped to win, having been predicted to win a supermajority. And narratives are different as to why that might be the case. But that didn't make her Prime Minister. It simply confirmed her position. And in so doing, also, she lost her majority. So, I don't know, confirmed her position, made her a manager. Make of it what you will. Golden Brown, texture-like sun, took over when Tony Blair resigned in 2007. And true enough, he too was not confirmed by a general election. Indeed, the next general election in 2010 was a bit of a, well, it was a coalition government. And there was absolute howls from the opposition about how we'd not elected this prime minister. Given that they've used it twice since, indeed. But it's nothing new because John Major, the grey man, did the same in 1990 when he took over from Margaret Thatcher because she resigned. So he became the de facto prime minister. And sure enough, there was a general election in 1992, which he surprisingly won. But then he carried on going and lost in the next general election in 1997. The one I haven't included a picture of is Callaghan, because I couldn't find a decent picture of Callaghan. I mean, there are plenty of pictures of Callaghan, but not ones that I wanted to show, and also I ran out of space. So Callaghan was the first of this trend in 1976 when he took over from Harold Wilson, who resigned on the grounds of ill health. Basically, he realised he'd got Parkinson's, I'm not joking, and he was worried that his memory going meant that he couldn't pursue being a prime minister the way he wanted to be prime minister. One of the things he was known for was his prodigious memory and ability to know when he last met someone. So he felt that that was too dangerous. He didn't tell anyone that he had these health problems, just resigned, and it only came out later why. But Callaghan took over. And again, there was no general election until 1979. So there's no guarantee of a change of prime minister leading to a general election. And in our system, that's perfectly normal. What's not normal, I guess, is the rapidity and the frequency this happens. But hey, there you go. 5 out of the last 8 prime ministers have been put in position, not because they've won a general election, but because they've replaced the previous office holder who has resigned. And that's just interesting to know. So when you're saying the source is the prime minister's power, it's the majority in the House of Commons, sure, with caveats like Churchill, but it doesn't necessarily follow that a general election is the source of a prime minister's power. It can be, in 3 out of 8 cases it has been, but it doesn't follow that that's necessarily a source of power. So when you're using it, be careful in an exam. It's tailor-made for a 2-sided paragraph as a general election when talking about where the powers of the prime minister come from. I'm going to take my face away again because I'm in the way, aren't I? I don't know, I mess around with the format and then I ruin it for myself. So what are the prime minister's powers? I've said where they come from, but what exactly are his powers or her powers? Well, they're essentially what we call royal prerogative. That is, they're the powers of the monarch. The Queen, I'm Queen, can pretty much do as she wishes. I'm free. I don't know, I'm just mixing and matching at this point, and it's just a silly voice. You can't see my face. Sorry. But the powers of the monarch are used by the prime minister in the monarch's stead, and we call that the royal prerogative. The Queen gets to give her powers to the prime minister. Now, this sounds like an odd distinction to make, but remember that the Queen is the head of state. And so those head of state powers can pass to the prime minister. And the prime minister may exercise those head of state powers more than the Queen does, basically, but only so long as the Queen picks them. The Prime Minister, therefore, determines who's in the government. He or she determines the membership of the government. That is, who holds what post and which posts there are to be held. So they can change departments of state. They can add new government departments depending on what they think is important. They can merge existing government departments, like Prime Minister Johnson has with the Department for International Development, DFID, and the Foreign Office. The idea was they were always supposed to be separate so that one could hold the other to account, but Johnson has decided they should both be run by the Foreign Office for diplomatic reasons rather than for humanitarian reasons. Furthermore, they can appoint senior civil servants. Remember the new Chief Cabinet Secretary. He's in post because Johnson wanted him there. He was Brexity enough, whereas the outgoing man wasn't. So that's a particularly powerful power, for want of a better phrase, that a prime minister has. Remember, they're supposed to be impartial, but they know that the prime minister can get them into position. Furthermore, the prime minister has the ability to appoint the judiciary because the powers of the Queen are that. And the prime minister can do that however they wish. But theoretically, there's a lot of things in the way. We'll talk about that when we talk about judiciary. But still, that's one of the powers of the prime minister. The prime minister also gets the royal prerogative power, the Queen's power, to appoint life peers to the House of Lords. They get to choose the list, they get to decide who's on that list, and they get to decide whether or not they listen to the advice of the House of Lords selection committee. Now, you've done a piece of work on that now, or at least you've looked at the source, I hope, and you know that prime ministers generally tend to accept advice, except not always. For the very first time ever, Prime Minister Johnson has ignored the advice of the committee. And that's unusual, really unusual, because it's the only time it's happened. So Prime Minister Johnson is using prime ministerial powers in a way that we've not seen any previous Prime Minister in the modern era use those powers. The Prime Minister also negotiates foreign treaties. They are the face of Britain to all other countries. The United Kingdom negotiates through the Prime Minister. And ultimately, what the Prime Minister says goes. There's none of what happens in the US where things are separated. If a Prime Minister agrees a treaty, it is assumed that Parliament has also agreed to that treaty unless it specifically throws it out. But that's rare because Prime Ministers are supposed to go to Parliament first, saying what they're going to negotiate before they go and negotiate it. This was tested almost to destruction with the EU Withdrawal Bill and the EU Withdrawal Act and the agreement that was reached just before Christmas. So what we've seen since 2019 is Parliament throwing its weight around a bit and a bit of a kerfuffle developing over who gets to say whether or not a treaty is ratified, i.e. whether or not the treaty makes sense and is accepted. So whilst the Prime Minister negotiates it and can appoint anyone in their stead to negotiate it for them, it's not their job fully to say that it's a treaty, though generally speaking, with the exception of the EU Withdrawal Bill, that's how it's worked in the past. They also direct military forces in combat. It's their decision. They're able to say when military forces are put into place. They're able to say for how long. They're able to affect the mission parameters. They're able to affect the rules of engagement. That's their job. Oops, no, that won't work. Click something. Come back. There we go. They also get the opportunity to announce nuclear Armageddon. They decide if we launch Trident missiles. Now the link there, and I'll put it in. Oh, I've not done it in Rockwell. Still in Calibri. I am rubbish. That link there, and you can click it on the PowerPoint version of this if you wish, or you can click it on the Show My Homework version of this lesson, will take you to a speech in Parliament by Theresa Human Rights Are Optional May, explaining how she'd be perfectly happy to murder tens of thousands of innocent women and children with nuclear weapons should the situation call for it. She then gets an interesting, it's part of PMQs, she then gets an interesting follow-up question from the Labour benches, which seems to agree with her point of view. I'm not saying anything in particular, I'm just saying it's weird that that was a thing that happened in Parliament. And I'm just saying it's weird that the answers she gave were the answers she gave. They were slightly terrifying to someone who remembers the Cold War. Boris Johnson, by the way, the new Prime Minister, very much supported that line of attack in PMQs and said as much in public. I realise that doesn't mean anything with Boris Johnson, but he is the new Prime Minister. I'm just saying it's really weird that that was said in public in the way that it was said. It is a watershed moment. It changed things. So I included. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. I think maybe it's, yeah, I don't think it's terribly long. Do watch it. It's worth it. So pause the video now and go and watch that link. I'm almost tempted to wait 3 minutes, so you have to go and watch it, but then that would be daft if you pause the video. So I'll move on. Other PM powers, are shared by the government. So basically, it's not just the Prime Minister that gets to do all of these things. For example, in 2013, the Ministry of Justice asked for a pardon of Turing. Turing had worked breaking German codes in the Second World War, and then in the 1950s had been convicted of homosexuality, which at that point was a crime. And he faced punishment. He was chemically castrated and eventually committed suicide because of the change to his emotional state caused by the chemical castration and the changing of his hormones. He couldn't deal with it. Turing is something of a war hero. He is something of a genius. The computers we use today are largely his brainchild. And I'm not even joking. So, and how we use them, the concept of AI, the concept of algorithms, the concept of learning machines, was his idea, and he dreamed about it and he made it happen. And so there was a public opinion that maybe we shouldn't remember him as a criminal. And so theoretically, he's still a criminal. It's on a record. His descendants are descendants of criminals, if you see what I mean. He doesn't have any, but you get my point. And so therefore, the notion was pushed that maybe Turing shouldn't be seen as a criminal. And then, because Turing was kind of a cause célèbre, they said, well, maybe none of the people convicted of homosexuality should be remembered as criminals, because this has an effect even today on their descendants. Maybe we should pardon them all. Before it got to Parliament, the Ministry of Justice in 2013 said, okay, we'll ask for a pardon for Turing, and did it, and got it, because that's their power. The Prime Minister's power, taken from the Queen, is to ask for pardons, I guess, but then he can pass that on, and it wasn't he, it was David Cameron at the time, to the Ministry of Justice, who can then ask for the pardon. So the powers of the Prime Minister are taken from the Queen, and then the Prime Minister can spread them around his government. That's what I was meaning there. That's what that example shows. Also, the Prime Minister creates the narrative of the government. They create how people see the government. Character and will. Yes, I've capitalized will because of something you'll be doing in political theory later on this year, and in much more depth if you do this at university. It's the fun stuff. The political will. Who is the will? Well, in this case, it's the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister often is the personification of the government. They are the personification of what it is to be in the executive. Sometimes that works, well, this way around with Thatcher. Thatcher created the personification of a government. She was first it, and then the government became it. So what do I mean? It was free market neoliberalism. You are free to fail, the harsh, uncompromising face of exactly what it was to be a neoliberal and to believe in the power of the free market. And you can see it in her face right there. I chose that photograph deliberately. I went looking because that personifies her as the Iron Lady. She's not for turning. She is cold, hard, uncompromising. There is no such thing as society. The enemy within. Rejoice, rejoice at the victories, and so on and so forth. It's what she's known for. Were we in class, I'd probably take this moment to show you some video clips of Thatcher in action. They're irrelevant to the course. I will place some links in Show My Homework, so you'll have seen them by the time you get here, on Thatcher to show her personifying her government and therefore setting the narrative. She created the narrative. And other times, the narrative comes to you. So David Cameron, seen here having hugged hoodies, and I don't know what the man in the background is doing, but he's definitely doing a gun action at the Prime Minister as he walks away. Note how he's not wearing a tie. That's very deliberate. Cameron sort of became known for social liberalism. That is, allowing people to live their own lives and government staying the heck out of it and not moralizing so much. He was a softer, squidgier conservative in many ways. Still just as neoliberal as Thatcher, but not as hard and uncompromising. I'd said he'd just come away from hugging hoodies. He literally said those words, we should hug a hoodie, because at the time there was moral panic about hoodies. People who wore hooded jackets and coats and hooded jumpers hanging around the street corners and being antisocial. And he said, well, no, we need to understand them, not punish them, which is unusual for a Conservative Prime Minister, or supposed to be Prime Minister, he was eventually, to say. This is from the election campaign. I share it because it's funny. But the point is, the narrative came to him. He didn't create that narrative. He was given the narrative and then had to live it. And it came back to bite him when it came to the referendum because, frankly, he didn't believe in this whole social liberalism. And it became very apparent very quickly that he was a bit of a moralizer. But it was too late. He created the narrative. The narrative had trapped him. There was nothing he could do about it. So sometimes prime ministers create it, and sometimes it is created for them, and they become the personification of what people assume they symbolize. And it's no accident that I've done 2 Conservative prime ministers, by the way. That's very deliberate. Government departments, also I think they're the ones mentioned in the textbook as well. So if you want to know more depth, it's in the textbook. I forget the page reference off the top of my head. I was looking for the textbook. I don't know where I put it. Government departments then. There are lots of different government departments, but the ones that we're going to focus on are the most important ones. And we're going to talk about cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers, and you saw the image up earlier with Bojo, and you've done your thing where I've done some of the cabinet, not all. And all of those people in the cabinet are cabinet ministers. They head up departments of state. On that A3 sheet, you should have noticed that literally every one of them runs something for the government. And most of them, I hope, are known to you as areas of government. So these departments of state are what runs the country, basically, that they decide how to work different bits, because one prime minister cannot do all jobs. Consider myself. When I was head of history and sociology, I couldn't literally teach every class. Trust me, I tried. And so when members of staff were off ill and I regularly switched so I could teach every class because I want to, it's fun. But I couldn't physically do that all the time. I required minions to do it for me. I am no longer head of history. That job, that pleasure, is now Mr. Cuthbert's, but he cannot teach all the history lessons, much as he wants to. Trust me, he wants to. He needs minions, he needs flunkies. I am now a minion, I am a flunky. So is Miss Wibley, so is Mr. Pop, and so, bizarrely, is Mr. McNamara, who is the head of the school. Ooh, interesting. But a prime minister cannot do all the jobs. They require flunkies to, listen to the reports and make decisions, so that the prime minister isn't making literally every decision. There are too many decisions to make, especially in something like coronavirus. You need to make decisions quickly and you need to make a lot of them. And you cannot do them all yourself. No one can. It's an impossible ask. So you need a team. And that cabinet can fluctuate in size. The departments of state can fluctuate in size. Now, most departments of state don't change. And therefore, these are positions that are filled by people that are considered political big dogs. Now, whether or not they're there for their expertise, we'll talk about later, or whether they're there for favours, we'll talk about that later, or whether they're there for some other reason, and we'll definitely talk about that later. They are senior members of the government. They are the big cheeses, the biggest of the cheeses. They are the gorgonzola, the sweaty sock cheese, parmesan. They are blocks of it, not the shaved stuff you buy in Tesco. I mean, you don't buy things at Tesco, goodness me. You go to proper shops. And they play a big role in terms of the administration of the government, keeping things going, shuffling the paper, making sure that everybody has the right forms filled in at the right time to make things occur. And these are important to record things and to make sure that proper permissions are given. And also in the creation of policy. I wrote admin and policy both, because of course I did. But they create policy as much as the Prime Minister does. They have a whole department of the civil service whose job it is to look at that area of government and to feed back to them what's going on in that area of government so they can make informed decisions. The big ones mentioned in the textbook are the Treasury, the Home Office, the Foreign Office, Education and Transport. They missed health. I was tempted to add it in, but then I thought, nah, 5's enough. Also, it amuses me, I don't know if you've noticed, but every picture of a cabinet minister that I've shown you for all of them, and including the ones you've been filling in, I don't know if you've noticed, but they're all holding folders. I don't know why they're all holding folders, but it amused me so much that literally every photograph I could find, they were holding a folder, that I just went with it and therefore deliberately tried to find pictures where they were holding a folder. It amuses me. Just so you know, that's Rishi Sunak on the left. He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Next, you have Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, about whom you know a bit, and we're going to come back to her as an example later. Dominic Raab, who knows all of where all about bodies are buried. He's the Foreign Secretary. Then we've got the Education Secretary. That's Gavin Williamson, winner of the Fireplace Salesman of the Year in 2007. I wish I were joking, but I'm not. Who is an interesting character. And then we have the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. So they are all the people that I brought in here. You've got a whole list of them now on A3. Check them if you don't know. I mean, pause at this point and shove a comment on the show my homework, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can if you want them checked. You don't have to do this right now. That department manages the area that they're department for. So the Department of Health, for example, under Matt Hancock. They tell him all the death figures, infection figures, the figures of people off with coronavirus and other reasons in the NHS, the number of nurses, the number of doctors, the money going in, the money going out, whether or not test and trace is failing, it is, whether or not the vaccine rollout is working, kinda, whether or not what the data is to try and make a decision. And then the civil service, having collated all that data for their master, the Secretary of State, will then try to suggest avenues. Now, it's not for them to say which is the best. The minister will tell them what they want to do, what the minister wants to do. So Matt Hancock will say, I want to do X, Y, or Z. And the department will then offer advice on that decision. Now, that department should be able to offer impartial and expert advice. And they should be able to do that regardless of what government is in charge. As a consequence, the civil service introduces legislation in the area, but yeah, the civil service has to be protected. So the Secretary of State, I've written it here as SOS, bears the ultimate responsibility for everything that happens in that department. If there is a mistake, if there is a problem, if there is a scandal, it is the responsibility of the Secretary of State. That means blame. Responsibility means blame. So if something goes wrong, the Secretary of State should resign. Now, we'll talk about this later on when we talk about ministerial responsibilities and collective ministerial responsibilities. But the Secretary of State is there to be a lightning rod for responsibility and blame. They are a politician. They can go to another job. The civil servants are supposed to offer impartial advice. If the advice doesn't work, that's not their business. They didn't choose it. They've got to offer the best advice they can. And if they don't agree with the policy, they've still got to be able to do that. And so the civil service support their Secretary of State. Each Secretary of State has a chief secretary, and their role is to be neutral, anonymous, and permanent. They've to be there regardless of government. They've got to be across their brief. They've got to understand the department. Cabinet reshuffles tend to be fairly frequent. They haven't been recently, but they tend to be fairly frequent. So the minister, the Secretary of State, might not be there for a very long time. But the Department of State is always there. And as a consequence, it follows that the civil service have to know what's going on, which plates are spinning, so that when a new Secretary of State comes in and wants to change everything, they have to advise, well, these things can be changed, but this can't be. I wanted to change it. Yeah, no, sorry, that it's in train. We're sympathetic, but right now we can't do anything. You're going to have to wait till this train pulls into a station before you can start changing the points, sir or ma'am. And they've got to decide on that. And so you need someone that's there a long time. So when I say permanent, they're often called permanent secretaries. They've got to be there long enough to get across their brief, to understand everything in their department. They've got to be anonymous so that no one can threaten them, bribe them, or otherwise try to influence them, because they've got to be impartial. And they've got to be neutral because they've got to be impartial. They can't say, well, I don't like your government, I'm going to give you bad advice. That would be awful, and then you couldn't trust them. They are there for ministers to basically be honest with, to say, well, what would you suggest? Or what do you think of this idea? Or why can't we just kill all the poor? There's a Mitchell and Webb sketch that's about that, by the way. That's where that comes from. I'll put the link in the Show My Homework or in the description below. Wait, that won't go in the thumbnail, is it? It's too late. So yeah, we'll talk about that later. They are not expected to take responsibility. That's not their job. That's the Secretary of State. So as to ensure that they give honest advice and do as they are told. Why have I put up Priti Patel and Philip? I can't remember his second name. Oh, it's gone from my head. It's not Pullman. He's an author. Because he resigned, having taken responsibility by writing a report about potential bullying in the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, sorry, and essentially saying that Priti Patel was a bully. When that report was denied by the Prime Minister, who said it's no business of his and it doesn't seem to him that she broke the ministerial code, he resigned, which is incredibly unusual. He took responsibility for the report, resigned, and then he's suing the Home Office for constructive dismissal and bullying. Civil servants don't tend to do this. It is really rare that that's something they do. So I thought that was worth mentioning. Anyway, that brings me to the end of this particular lesson. There's a lot to go on in there, and it may take longer than a full hour, and I apologize if that's the case. Do keep me posted. I'll continue posting the work as I'm doing at the moment, but keep me posted. Let me know in the comments on Show My Homework, in the lesson on Thursday. Let me know if this is going too quickly or if you can't keep up, because then I'll change what I'm doing to fit what you're capable of doing as a class. If workload is too much, please don't feel you have to suffer in silence. Quite the contrary. We're all doing this for the first time. I rely on feedback from you. So if it's too difficult or you're not able to keep up, let me know. I will provide you time to catch up. It is important you know these things, sure, but it's also important you do so at a pace that is manageable and that you don't go under. We are ahead of the game. I've said this plenty of times, but we really are ahead of the game. We are scorching through this course. So if you need me to slow down, you've got to tell me. Anyway, thank you if you have been for watching. Have a lovely rest of day, and I shall see you tomorrow for the next bit on ministerial responsibilities and collective ministerial responsibility. We'll do case studies after Thursday. Thank you very much.